All right, so what I'd like to cover today, and I'm all right if it takes a little bit of time. Like I said last week, or Monday, whatever day the last day was, this is some of the most basic material. I don't mean basic, I mean fundamental material in sociology. And so I want to take today to talk about Marx and Weber, although I'll be kind of impressed if we can do both in one day. And I like talking about these guys, so for my sake, we might take more in one day. But that's our goal, Marx and Weber today. Last week we did Durkheim. Did anybody have any questions on Durkheim? I felt a little like that was Durkheim very, very condensed. But so it goes, right? Go ahead.
You remember you were talking about normlessness?
Yes.
What is that again?
Okay, so the question is about normlessness. Let me back this up. So Durkheim's got this fundamental idea, and well, I'll say that in a second. Durkheim's got this fundamental idea that the human animal, us as individuals, need culture to put some limit on our appetites. Okay? Our appetites are infinite. We need culture to put a limit on our appetites. If we don't have that, it leads us to unhappiness and sometimes even self-destruction. All right? And the worst case scenario is to go from having a limit to no limit whatsoever. And the pop stars that go from nothing to, well, the Bieber, right? Nice little kid playing guitar on YouTube, and then all of a sudden he's a gazillionaire, and then he's a flaming disaster, right? So you go from a life that's bounded with caps on your ambition to you can really buy and wreck whatever supercar he wants, and he's not even old enough to drink. That's a recipe for someone to go berserk, if you will. Lottery winners, kind of the same way. And Durkheim also sees that happening at the cultural level. So, this is interesting. One of the implications, and this holds up under cross-cultural research, we wouldn't expect Americans to be that happy. Do you know why? Because you all think you legitimately have a shot at being millionaires. Even though we're starting life in middle Georgia, and most millionaires start somewhere else, we all think we can make it, right? And when we don't make it, we end up unhappy, right? But in a world that has less social mobility and less ideology around social mobility, you know your place, and your place is frustrating, but you're happy. It's kind of a counterintuitive finding. We fight against our boundaries, but in fact, those boundaries are what define us and give us meaning. You take the boundaries away, and people go a little bit crazy. All right? Now, he compares that in the book Suicide to the difference between Protestants and Catholics. And pay attention, because this will play, or at least keep listening for today, because this will come up a little bit later. But the way Durkheim's looking at Protestants versus Catholics, and he throws Judaism in as well, but just sort of as an off side note. Yeah. Catholicism, because you've got the priest who's morally in charge of everybody, and when you screw up, you got to go talk to the priest. Dear priest, I gossiped behind my sister's back, right? There's a moral component to life in the church as a Catholic, and you got to be in contact with everybody, right? You have to go to church on Sunday. And so there's this community focus in Catholicism that Durkheim argues is relatively lacking in Protestantism. Does this mean Protestants don't have community? No, obviously not. It means that on average, they're a little bit lower. Just like men are a little bit taller than women, right? on average, this is what we're looking at. In that environment, Durkheim says the fact that your moral life is between you and God, and for most of you, God doesn't speak back on a regular basis, and the fact that your involvement in your community is entirely voluntary. Like if you don't agree with your church, you don't have to go on Sunday. That does not fly in Catholicism. It doesn't matter how much you dislike your priest, you're going to church on Sunday, and if you have to, you're going to go to a different church on Sunday, right? So that community is important. Durkheim says that this difference in those two variables between Catholics and Protestants is going to lead Protestants to have a higher suicide rate as a community. More people per 100,000 are going to commit suicide in a society that's lower on these community variables than a community that's higher on these community variables. All right? I'm glad you brought that up. That's central to understanding Durkheim. And when we get to talking about the other two characters today, you're going to recognize that in their own way, each of these theorists is dealing with sort of the same set of questions. I love it. Good job. I have to say, Durkheim's one of my favorites. He's a little bit unfashionable now because he hasn't been fashionable in a while, but that's okay because I still love him. And because he's focusing on how societies work together, he's in many ways the grandfather of what became functionalism, which was very hip in the 40s and 50s, and then kind of went down again. But yes, go ahead.
That's where we didn't finish off. We were getting on the subject of his suicide thing, and he had to leave class. So.
That's right. Yeah, and I just actually gave it to you. That's actually it. So moral regulation is one of the variables that's going to keep a community from having a high suicide rate, meaning we're all involved in each other's business. Now notice, we sort of hate that about small towns, except we also sort of sometimes love it about small towns, but Durkheim says it's a stabilizing factor, right? And the same thing with integration. And integration, in today's words, in today's lingo, you would call it social capital, meaning just how many nodes in your network there are. And a tighter knit community will have a lower suicide rate. That's what he's going to say. Now, here's where Judaism comes in. So Judaism's theology is significantly different than Catholicism's and Protestantism's, and that's fine. And I don't know anything about Judaism, so don't ask me about the theology, just that it's different. But they have a suicide rate that's much closer to the Catholics than to the Protestants, okay? And so Durkheim starts asking, well, and again, Durkheim does not think these are theological differences. So he asks, we know that theology doesn't matter. What's going on in Judaism that allows for a different suicide rate? And he goes back to those same variables. And what he says is, Judaism is even tighter than Catholicism when it comes to that community integration. Now remember, Durkheim is writing at the turn of the 1900s in Europe. This is about 35 or 40 years before Hitler launched his experiment. And Jews were getting run out of Eastern Europe and Western Russia in pogroms already. There was a large immigration wave of Judaism at that time period in the United States because they're like, we're out of here. And he says, and think about ethnic groups here in the U.S. right now. He says, in this environment, Jewish people have to band together, right? Because there's a common enemy, and that, it's not just that there's an outside society, there's a good chance that outside society is going to be fairly hostile. They've got every reason to believe that their neighbors don't like them. So they hold together, and you can see, I don't know about moral regulation, how that fits in, but you can see how social integration is going to matter, right? And and the community stays together. Because the community stays together, that's that community defense against a high suicide rate. Go ahead.
What about the other data set about how they're using sociologists for PTSD?
Mm-hmm.
Usually they'll take a group of like wounded warrior, i.e. PTSD, and they'll actually have them go together in groups and like do trips. For instance,
I like
in
it.
Miami, they have a wounded warrior. It's like a camp where they're all together, and instead of being like individual counseling, they group them together.
I like it.
You like your kind?
That would actually fit. So, so the comment is one way to treat wounded vets, for instance, is individual counseling. But you'll notice individual counseling doesn't fit what we were just talking about here. I mean, I'm sure it works for some folks, and I'm certainly not trying to pick on the psych people in any way, shape, or form. But you're trying to treat an individual problem, okay? And if Durkheim is correct in any way, it may well be that what these guys need is some community cohesion. So at least one proposed or one method of treatment, rehabilitation, well, whatever we want to call it, is to take these vets with PTSD and put them in groups and then go do community building things, right? Like trips or adventures or something.
Like out in the community, but still like, they said with people with PTSD, they have a problem socializing. So they get them in these groups and take them like to a beach where they're together, but there's also other people around.
Yeah, it's
Socially integrated.
a good idea. I like it. I like it. That is good. That fits into Durkheim. You want them to build a certain cohesion with each other, as well as integrate into the rest of larger society. I like it. That is good. That is a good example. Go ahead.
When you brought up Catholics, last semester I did a paper on physician-assisted suicide after the girl went through with it, and how the Catholics were like, in a sense, degrading her, saying she's going to go to hell and stuff like that. And when I dug deeper and deeper and was reading her story more, in a sense, okay, she had help killing herself, but in a sense, she was already being killed by the cancer that she had. You know, she was already dying, and it's just, she kind of, sped up the process of, but she was in constant pain. You know, the physician-assisted suicide, you know, you have to have a terminal illness, like a terminal cancer like she had. She had brain cancer. You know, you have to have 6 months to live, and you have to meet certain requirements, because like Oregon and Washington, and I think Vermont now, they've passed that.
Right.
And I don't know, it was just really interesting reading on that.
Sure.
And I don't know, it just seems like, in a sense, they just know they're going to die. They just don't want to die in a painful way.
Yeah. So the comment is, where does something like physician-assisted suicide fit into this? And I hope I'm not putting words in your mouth, but I know that the people in back have trouble hearing. And that's an interesting question. So if you take the case last year, Catholics, from a theological perspective, are going to say, no, you shouldn't be committing suicide at all, right? But they're looking at that theologically. As sociologists, I don't even know how we would try and look at that, because it's its own specific case, and you're looking at, whether it's okay or not has everything to do with, A, what you think of it, B, how much pain was she really in, C, how terminal was the disease. There are a whole lot of issues going on there. And the fact is, like abortion, this is something that there really is not a coherent perspective on in the United States. People disagree and disagree very heartily. But stepping back, what you're really going to look for if you're going to try and do a sociological analysis on this, more than this person's committing suicide or this person's committing suicide, is what groups, what subsets of society have higher suicide risks, right? And returning vets are terrible for this. it's kind of scandalous, which is why we don't hear as much about it as we should, right? Here's another example. We've all heard that gay, lesbian, bi questioning teenagers are a very high risk for suicide. Well, if you think about it, if you are the only gay kid you know, and your family's not accepting of what you're trying to do, and your friends in your small town aren't accepting of what you're trying to do, we're blaming on this person's homosexuality what may well be a result of being utterly alone, right? Because the moral regulation that this person's getting is not a moral regulation that's in any way supportive. It's not guiding him or her to a healthy sexuality. It's telling him, you're a disaster, right? And none of us like to hear that. Shame. No, that's not cool. And the second thing is, there's no one around that this person's relating to. So that kind of fits that model too. I do have to say, we really have to qualify Durkheim's hypothesis on this, because this is 100 years old. And in fact, it's getting on 115 or 120 years old. And so even if his analysis was completely correct then, and it's hard to say it was or wasn't, because, here we are now. It's a very long time ago. The world we're in now has definitely changed. I'd be interested to know if Catholics and Protestants have, for instance, different suicide rates. Or if it's that simple, do the Protestants separate out differently? Where do they fit compared to, there's a lot more you could do if you went back and revisited it. But the real issue, the real takeaway with Durkheim is, one, something as individual as whether or not you want to kill yourself is influenced by outside social factors, whether you recognize it or not, right? Number two, it's one of the very first empirical social science pieces, okay? We're going to talk about Marx, and we're going to talk about Weber next. And Marx, very, very insightful, very smart. He was an economist. He was also quite a lot like a philosopher. He looked around, he saw what he saw, and he thought really, really hard about it. Weber, much more scientific, meaning empirical, than Marx. But even Weber is using historical methods for most of what he talks about. And history is great as a social science. A historian that does his or her work well is a gem. But it's hard to do something like modern statistics with history because we just don't have the data. Durkheim represents one of the first big popular writers of sociology. He's doing a certain amount of marketing, trying to say, even suicide is social, and he's trying to establish sociology as a real, capital R, science with data and analysis that stands up against anything that the physical scientists are doing, okay? And when you think about kind of the image issue we have right now, well, the real sciences, they're kind of snobs and they don't think we're real serious. The fact that Durkheim is trying to address this 110 years ago shows just how important he was. All right? There's one more Durkheim component. That collective conscience that I talked about last time, recognize that, well, let me say it differently. I'll end up, and probably in this class too, I end up spending a lot of time talking about culture or about mythology, and I don't mean, the old Greek gods. I don't mean Thor. I mean the narratives that we believe that are fundamental to creating our culture and our worldview, right? That's what Durkheim's talking about when he's talking about collective consciousness or collective conscience. I believe, I've been told it translates both ways. I don't know enough French to know. But as a for instance, could I stand here in Warner Robins at Middle Georgia State College and say, the military sucks ass and soldiers are baby killers, right? All of a sudden, people are looking up. What did he say? Right? And the answer is no, I can't say that, right? Do some people think that? Absolutely. And they're free to think it. This is America. You can think whatever you want. But regardless of what you think of the president, regardless of what you think of our foreign policy, individual soldiers are special. And part of our national religion is you're not really allowed to pick on them. Right? That's part of our mythology, that these guys are heroes. Just stop by a veterans high school football game some weekend if you're unsure of how important this as mythology is, right? That's what Durkheim is talking about. Now, everybody watched football last weekend. Even if you didn't want to, probably someone in your house had it on and you suffered through it. When you're thinking about advertising's trying to tickle that mythology. We had a whole conversation after class, a couple of you, where we ended up, well, maybe it was just Amanda. We ended up talking about the Always commercial, Run Like a Girl. And it's kind of humorous as a guy because it's it makes you giggle. But what they're trying to do is reach a group of women who have a certain shared belief that women kick ass. And a subcomponent of that shared belief is not only do they kick ass, but they're actually not given credit for it. Right? That's part of the mythology of many American women. And a lot of them wear Always maxi pads. Right? So Always doesn't say, I mean, this is going to be kind of funky, but only because I'm a guy, right? Always doesn't say, look how much blue juice our stuff holds. Always doesn't say, look at the wings that help it fly. Always doesn't say, look, it's got an arrow clearly labeled front and back. It says, look how awesome women are. Right? Now, you think you make decisions based on your rationality. You know what your rationality tells you? This one holds more blue juice than that one. This one's got nice clear arrows. Right? But you don't make your decision based on that. You make your decision based on how effectively that brand communicates with your belief system, your mythology. And when you start thinking about it, the football commercials you remember are the ones that did that the best. Right? So advertisers understand what Durkheim means by collective consciousness. Politicians understand what Durkheim means by collective consciousness. To not recognize that and that was why I spent so much time talking about how real it is and how the internet helps us understand that. To not recognize that is to not recognize how much you're open to manipulation, right? So anyway, and I was like, oh, we got to get collective consciousness. Got to get collective consciousness. Okay, very good. Should we do some Marx? All right. So I absolutely dig Marx. Goodbye, Durkheim. What do we say about Marx? So Marx is writing in the 1850s-ish. So he's about 50 or 60 years ahead of Durkheim and Weber, all right? 60 years from now is like 1950s. That's how far ahead of these guys he was. Marx would not have called himself a sociologist. He would have called himself an economist. Sociology as a discipline really hadn't been invented yet. But both Durkheim and Weber are writing in ways that respond directly to some of Marx's points. Like there's a discussion going on here between them, which is why Marx gets included. Marx also is the one who put forward the idea of communism. Communism as a legitimate political concern has waxed and waned over time. There was a big push in the United States during the Great Depression, perhaps unsurprisingly. Large chunks of the world were at times communist, at least in name. And clearly some of his ideas influenced modern socialist ideas, including the ones of the Nordic countries, which we kind of like, and including modern Democrats. I know, right? Now, that said, Marx also has a terrible reputation. And I always get a little nervous trying to teach Marx in, well, anywhere in the US, but especially halfway rural Georgia, because I already know 80% of the white folks in here voted against each and every Democrat they possibly could, just because, right? And so Marx is this evil commie, okay? Now, there's problems with Marx's thought. But before we get there, this whole prelude is please don't close your mind to what this man had to say before we get around to actually reading it. And for what it's worth, I learned at least as much free market economic theory reading Marx as I did reading the Austrian economists. A couple of you will understand that. So, what's important for Marx? This first bit here, the mode of production. Marx essentially assumes that we humans are animals and we have animal needs. That means we need food, we need water, we need shelter, we need sex. Yes, we need sex, because without sex, everything ends in about 25 years, right? So those are the things we need as animals. Every society, by definition, helps its members fulfill those needs. For Marx, that is the mode of production. What you're producing is your life. So if we go to the Plains Indians in the United States here, those guys had a buffalo-oriented economy. If we go to modern Saudi Arabia, they have an oil-oriented economy. What they can't make out of oil, they can buy and gold coat with oil money, right? The Central American, brain fart, civilizations from before pre-European contact here were corn societies. That was how they met their basic needs, right? And they were able to do everything based on that. Okay, so the mode of production is the economy. It is how we meet our economic needs, our animal needs, number one. Number two, he sees an almost mechanical rise and fall of economies. All right? Now, what does that mean? Well, any system that's effective is going to have its own share of contradictions, weaknesses, whatever, right? And a system can grow and grow and grow and grow until those weaknesses are too large to overcome. So if we go back to those Central American corn-oriented civilizations, there was a point when they just flat out outgrew their resource base. And as such, they weren't going to go any further, all right? Now, Marx sees at least Western history. He would say all history, but I'm not prepared to talk about all history by any stretch of the imagination. He's going to look at Western history throughout Europe in its feudal era, and he's going to say that feudalism rose as a response to earlier problems, and feudalism fell partly because it had its own internal contradictions, and partly because capitalism was rising. There's kind of a dinosaur and comet problem here, insofar as the feudalists, the feudal society is based on a handful of aristocracy taxing the living daylights out of a very large peasantry and killing the people next door so that they don't come tax your peasantry. Land is wealth in feudal Europe. And so you spend all of your effort protecting that wealth. So you have knights, and you have outposts, and you have aristocracies, and the whole thing is around protecting your territory and protecting your political power. If you had anything like a political uprising, you had a really grisly, gruesome, ugly execution, which reminded everybody who was in physical control of that territory. All right? The only thing is, now we talked about the Industrial Revolution, right? The only thing is, since their blinders they had blinders on, like we all do. Their blinders were, since they understood land and physical control to, is that me? No, okay. Since they understood physical control of land to be where power came from, they just ignored traders. Now, every society needs traders, not traitors, traders, like Trader Joe. And since they just ignored them. They also ignored the handymen, right? And every society needs somebody who makes shoes. So the handymen and the traders live in the cities, and they're tinkering with how to do what they do, and they're making shoes, and they're making this, and they're making that. But for the most part, the royalty just isn't paying any attention whatsoever. But remember, we talked about industrialism. As those little machines got better and better and better, and some power started coming online for these things, these guys started to make more and more and more money, right? But again, the aristocracy didn't care. You know why the aristocracy didn't care? Because what matters is physical control of physical territory. And you can kind of see exactly what happens. So these guys over here, they start making more money and gaining influence and making more money and gaining influence until eventually the industrialists have enough money that they can buy influence, right? And these guys, the aristocracy of old, because they're the dinosaurs. Here comes industrial capitalism. That's that particular comment. These guys are still, dueling and having... I can't help but think of Monty Python, but you get the idea, right? These guys are fighting this until they're actually irrelevant, And, of course, the Brits, they still have their royalty. Isn't it cute? Princess Kate is nice to look at, and they've got babies. But they don't really run anything, do they? No, it's kind of a figurehead, except they do happen to be the biggest landholder in all of London. So what power they do retain is economic, which fits this new model perfectly. So this is industrial capitalism. Now, Marx saw, in the exact same way that feudalism was going to rise and then fall based on its own internal contradictions and weaknesses, modern capitalism is going to rise and it's going to fall, just like any other civilization, just like any other economic system, okay? Now, this is where Marx gets a little bit weird, because there are two distinct flavors, especially amongst the people that study him later. One flavor says, an economic revolution is inevitable, simply because it's a mechanical system and it's got an up and a down and that's that. And another part said, viva la revolucion, let's get it on, bitches. This side over here, I think, kind of ends up coloring red, the analysis. And I think the analysis is pretty helpful, whereas his future prediction was a little bit shaky, okay? All right, now, because in Marx's world, everything comes back to economics, there's at least two things that matter there, one of which isn't necessarily in the slide. The first is all of society can break into two classes, right? You've got owners, and then you've got everyone else, okay? And this makes a certain amount of sense. If you've got $1 million in the bank, that's good. That's sweet. You think you're rich. You're making $150,000 a year. That's nice. You're comfortable. You're not rich, right? If you think about the country, and you go out, I just love the parking lots here. You look out across the parking lot and there's a sea of cars. To a regular person, it's just a long way to walk to get a parking spot. But if you're thinking economically, then what you're looking at is a factory producing revenue on car loans. Every car in that lot is producing income for someone. If you've got it paid off, you're using it to go to college, get a better job, or go to work and make money today. Otherwise, it's a stupid thing to spend your money on, right? That's an investment. It's actually not an investment, but roll with me here. If it's not paid off, then you're doing whatever you're doing. More importantly, you're sending $200, $300, $500 a month to a bank to pay it off, right? And in the end result, the bank, it might not seem like they make that much off of your car, right? Oh, about a $10,000 card, I spent $1,000 on interest in 5 years. You don't spend more than $5,000 on it, right? Except if the bank makes 10,000 auto loans this month, then that $5,000 matters, and it matters a whole lot. Well, if you start thinking about the physical world that way, who owns the Coca-Cola Tower up in Atlanta, right? It's not some individual who has $1 million in the bank, some trust fund kid. It's owned by big corporations, big holding companies, and they're charging rent from Coke, unless Coke owns it, and Coke is making plenty of money. Who owns the CNN Tower? Who owns, the Old National across the street? That's not the name of that bank. Robbins Federal across the street, right? Well, the credit union owns it, and the credit union's making a profit on it. Hopefully they're sharing it with you, because that's what a credit union is. If you think about the world from a Marxist sense, every single thing in it is either being consumed, right? Like I need a sweater because I'm cold, and it's going to wear out, or it's generating profit. That sweater is making money for Aeropostale or Hollister or whatever white people brand my children got it from. See what I'm saying? That means every car, every laptop, every building is generating profit. When you're driving around Macon and you're passing a building that's completely abandoned and looks like hell, that building is ignored because it's not generating profit, right? And people just walk away. As long as it's making profit, we're going to maintain it. When it's not making profit, we'll walk away. On your way to Atlanta on 75 here, you'll pass Tifton. Is that it? Tifton College? It's not a college, is it? Why? Because it stopped generating profit for the state. We'll use those buildings for something else, but it's not going to be a college, okay? Now, when you think about that, that's where you get this owners versus everyone else. And the owners have quite a bit. Like, we're talking hundreds of millions. And everyone else is selling their labor. So for Marx, those two people are the bourgeois, which is a French word, the root of so-and-so, so bourgeois in today's terminology, and the proletariat. I don't think I have that up there, do I? Okay, it's on a later slide. The proletariat and the bourgeoisie. And the proletariat, you ever had a by the hour job? You're a proletariat. Proletariat sells their life because that's all they have to sell. The owners deploy their capital resources, be they factories or CNN towers or community banks, and they are making money on that, right? So they're always harvesting profit off of their resources. The rest of us are selling our life 1 hour at a time. Does that make sense? That's one of the essential differences. The second essential difference is that because for Marx, everything goes back to economics, that means that includes religion, culture, academics, okay? So if we went to the Harvard Business School or Wharton Business School at UPenn, any of the Ivy MBA programs, do you think they're going to teach Marxist socialism? No, right? Who's signing up for theology programs? Nobody. What those bellwether, like badass educational institutions are teaching is modern international capitalism. And we believe in capitalism, almost at a religious level, right? So that if I were to stand up here and critique capitalism too hard, one of you guys would be like, recording me and then reporting me to some conservative think tank somewhere. I just saw that on Facebook this morning. Evil professor picks on Fox News. Yeah, no doubt. Anyway, I'm not allowed to pick on capitalism. If I do, someone's going to go out and report me, and then I'm going to be on Facebook. I don't want to be on Facebook. But you get the idea, right? Interesting. Okay, what about religion? Well, according to Marx, religion follows as well. You'll notice that the American interpretation of Christianity somehow or other is very different than the give away all your crap and hang out with the hippie. I mean, I seem to remember a couple of verses in the Bible about that. It's been a long time. But I kind of remember Jesus saying, don't get attached to shit in this world. In fact, leave your stuff. Put that fishing net down. The fishing net is a means of production, isn't it? And what's Jesus saying? Just walk away, buddy. All right. Somehow or other, when that message gets filtered through American religion, we end up with Joel Osteen. God wants you to be rich. Right? Now, I'm no theologian, and I can't say that their message is right. I can't say their message is wrong. I can say that if we want to take Marx even a little bit seriously, it's no surprise that God wants you to be rich is an American form of Christianity. Does that make sense? Okay, now that last little bit there, false consciousness, it's kind of fallen off the bottom. Well, let me go one step further before we get to that, because it'll make it a little bit more sense out of this. If you're working at a chicken factory, right? That's my favorite example for obvious reasons. But if you're working at a chicken factory, you're working, right? How much do you make? I think the going rate's what, $9, $10 an hour now over at Purdue. So there you are, you're at the chicken factory, you're making $9 an hour. I just did the math on this the other day. So the boneless, skinless breast room can put out somewhere in the neighborhood of 10,000. It's more than that, actually, but we'll go with 10,000. 10,000 platters of boneless, skinless in a shift, right? And those boneless, skinless breasts go for something like $6 or $7 a plate. That's $60,000 per shift in that one room, right? And they're doing with maybe $1,000 worth of employee time. Okay? Now, if I own the chicken factory and I take that $60,000 and I put $1,000 into employee time, like buy off my employees, come back tomorrow, please, and $1,000 into overhead, then I take my $58,000 and I invest it in a Mercedes. And this is important, right? So as the owner, me, is rolling around in my Mercedes with an awesome sound system, thumpity, thumpity, thump, right? I'm passing my employees, and my employees are looking and they're secretly hating me, but also secretly hoping someday they can be millionaires. Where did that money come from? You'll notice that if you follow Marx's train of thought, that wealth is harvested from your employees. Every ounce of profit was built by those employees on the line. Now, if I can pay my employee $100 a day, but harvest $1,000 from renting that employee's labor out for a day, then essentially I stole $900 worth of that employee's lifetime. Does that make sense? Now, you don't have to agree with this, and I could easily make the argument the other way, so don't think I'm trying to sell you on being a Marxist. But I do want you to recognize that if you take Marx seriously, this is kind of an essential assumption. Okay, now, what about the fact that I've got 100 employees in my chicken factory and it's only me and my Mercedes? Wouldn't it be a disaster if the employees at the chicken factory recognized where my wealth was coming from? You see how that works? The best thing I could do would be to keep them from noticing. Because if the employees recognize my wealth comes from their work, they might actually try and claim that wealth. This is actually one of the contradictions Marx is going to talk about. All right. The moment we all recognize that we're being screwed, and we get together and we say, we're going to politically and economically reorganize this system, we have achieved class consciousness, realizing we have a shared understanding, a shared need. It's also when the revolution happens, you'll notice, especially in Marx's thinking. False consciousness is anything that keeps us from recognizing our shared oppression. Anybody see the football game last week? How was your life changed when Seattle dropped the ball? It was fun to watch, right? Did you make any more money this week? Well, if you bet right. Are you driving a nicer car? Do you have a better job? Is your spouse better looking? Are your children doing better in school? The answer is, as much as you cared about that game, it matters jack shit for your life. All right? Same thing with politics, right? I'm so sick of red-blue politics. I wish it would just die. But we're going to turn on the news and, or Facebook or wherever you get your media, and Fox News is going to feed you what you need to get you Republican pissed off. Facebook and Daily Kos and Democratic Underground are going to feed you what you need to get Democratic pissed off, and you're going to hate the other side. Do you really think Bill Gates, Warren Buffett's life is changed because I voted for Romney or Obama? Do you think my life has changed because I voted for Romney or Obama? And yet, I have relatives I can't talk to over these debates. You know what you call that? False consciousness. That's what these ideas are for Marx. Okay. Let's go to the next slide. I'm sure we'll get through all of them today. Okay, we got all that. So now there's an alienation issue which is important to Marx as well. And the alienation issue, get it? Fake. The alienation issue is as follows. So I've got this neighbor actually, so let me start over here. I've got this neighbor who lives across the street from me. He seems to have some sort of construction business in his front yard. He's got an air compressor in his garage. He's got a pickup truck. His pickup truck is usually pretty shiny, but it's full of crap. He's got 3 or 4 awful pickup trucks, which are also full of crap. And there's about 4 guys that show up in the morning at 7 o'clock, and they all get together and they go off to do stuff. Here's what's important about this. Notice this guy owns his truck, actually owns his several trucks. He's paying a wage to these other fellas. He owns the tools, and he seems to be getting work based on some connections he has in town. He's got a client list, right? And a client list has value. Let's go to the chicken factory guy. You're in the chicken factory, right? And 8 hours goes by. Do I own the chicken coming in this side? Nope, someone else owns the chicken. All right. Do I own the chicken going out that side that's going to get sold to somebody? Nope. So all that work, and I can't actually benefit from it. I just get a wage. How abstract. Do I own the knife? Nope. The building? Nope. The cutting board? Conveyor belt. The conveyor belt? Nope. I don't even own the safety gear. Right? So here I am in a situation where I don't own the tools, I don't own the raw materials, I don't own the finished product, and I can't even say I own skills, because every factory owner everywhere knows that as soon as you can make a system that can pop a wishbone without wasting breast meat better than a human, they're going to buy that system and fire all the workers. So any skill I have is only temporary. All right? Look how different that is than my neighbor. My neighbor goes Lowe's, buys crap, sells it to his end result. He's got skills. He's got some business sense running the business. He owns all of his tools. In a Marxist sense, the chicken factory worker is alienated from his or her labor. My neighbor is not. His life, his mode of production is part and parcel with him and allows him to express a wide variety of skills. There's the construction skills, yeah, I'm dry. The construction skills, the business skills, the personnel skills, and the fix-it skills, because everyone knows that machines break a lot and you got to fix them, especially those old cars. But you get the idea. He's not alienated from his labor at all. The chicken factory worker, completely alienated from labor. Okay, so you don't have the raw materials, you don't have the tools, you don't have the workplace, you don't even have the skills, you don't have the finished product. And you know who buys those chicken breasts? No. Right? It's going to some faceless person somewhere. When this guy puts up drywall, he knows the spec builder whose house he's working on. Now, you don't know who's going to buy the house, but he knows the spec builder. Like, there's a guy there who's, okay, I'm going to build this for you. It's kind of a cool thing when you think about it. My neighbor is kind of an anti-Marxist, not in a Marx is bad sort of way, but in everything Marx complained about, he's managed to avoid. Now, he has to worry about things that the construction worker, that the chicken factory worker doesn't. When business slows down, he starts looking a little nervous. And, the chicken factory guy's like, woohoo, half hour off today. But also look at this. If you got to spend, and let's face it, most adults don't work 8 hours a day. Most adults are working 9, 10 hours a day. You throw in a drive anywhere, and here in Georgia, everybody drives a zillion miles everywhere. You're gone from your house, 10, 11 hours a day? I don't know about you, but I married my wife because I kind of liked her. And if I'm gone 11 hours a day and she's gone 11 hours a day and we don't even overlap, when do I get to see her? Yeah, not real often, right? There was a warm spot in bed. I think she was there at some point. If you do manage to hook up, you might pop out a couple of pups. And, you don't really get to hang out with them because you're gone all the time. And that's okay because they have to go get turned into factory people at the public school. You live in a world where the whole purpose of doing that job is to have your life, and you don't get to actually have your life because you're too busy selling your life 1 hour at a time so that you can get the money that you need to actually hang out with this person. If the guy across the street had kids, at least one possibility, and some of you grew up on farms, at least one possibility is they can help him. Now, it might not be awesome to work at mom and dad's business, but look what you get, which other kids don't. 10 hours a day with mom and dad, and not just spending time with them, which is in the last analysis the only real resource we have, but not just spending time with them, but spending time creating your living. If we went back 1,000 years, it would be the same as going out with mom and dad to dig up potatoes, wild potatoes, and to hunt down animals, because that's what you're doing. You're creating, you're meeting your animal needs through this work. All right. So I don't think we're going to get to Weber. We don't need that. All right, we don't need Weber. Well, we need Weber, but I can't do Weber in 10 minutes, 15 minutes. No, please, 10. All right, so one of the problems you're going to bump into if you start thinking about Marx is, if he's so brilliant, why didn't it all work out? And you need to think that about everybody all the time. You don't get smarter by saying, I love this theory. How can everything I see fit into this theory? You get smarter by saying, I love this theory, but what's actually wrong with it? Which is usually what we reserve for our enemies. The first is false consciousness. The power of the red-blue side is pretty strong. We don't recognize we have shared interests. You actually think New York is against you because you're Georgia. And let's face it, the white folks and the black folks down here in the South will be friendly in public. I have a friend. That's all wonderful. You don't even need football when the class divisions and political divisions and all of that go as deep as they do, right? So that's at least one. Another part of that is, I wasn't kidding when I said that everybody thinks they're going to be millionaires. You have these awesome surveys that people will do from time to time. And they'll ask, what's the likelihood you're going to end up a millionaire? You'll be able to work your way up to $1 million at some point in your life. And, by the time you're at $1 million, you're in the top maybe 5% of the population. You're in the 95th percentile. Fully 50% of the population thinks they're going to be able to achieve that. You go. That's false consciousness, and it works wonders, right? Go ahead.
If you don't have that, though, isn't that just kind of like saying give up and settle for average?
So the question is, if you don't have that, does that mean give up and settle for average? I don't know what to tell you how to live your life. I'll leave that to you. But I will say, as long as you keep making me money working for an impossible dream, you go for it, baby. See what I'm saying? Go ahead.
You're stating it half empty. It's like you only use 10% of your brain. Use all of your brain, you only use 10% of your potential. Everybody has the potential to be a millionaire. So saying that only 5% can actually earn that doesn't have anything to do with the potential that can actually be a millionaire. Potentially, everybody can be.
Well, sorry, but no. You're doing great, though. You seem tough, so I can be a little more direct. It sort of depends on what we mean by that. You'll notice if everybody self-actualized and everybody learned the rules of the game, we could all be more well off materially, because we all learned the rules of the game, and spiritually, socially, whatever you want to call it, because we self-actualized in psych terminology, but we're still stuck with who's going to take out the garbage, right? And we still got to have garbage men. And I'm sure that there are happy garbage men in the world, but let's face it, we don't really give them a ton of respect. Part of what you're saying is anybody has the potential, we certainly can do better, and as long as other people aren't actually playing the game correctly, then I actually do have a shot. But as long as there's inequality of any sort, there will be a top 5% and everybody else, just because that's what inequality means by definition. And you'll also notice, maybe it seems like a glass half empty or half full sort of thing. You'll notice that you live at a time and in a country where materially you are the 1%. Even the poorest of us is more well-to-do than kings and queens 200 years ago, right? The poorest. Our poor people are fat. Irish poor people 100 years ago starved to death, right? So you're right, we're already there, and we still focus on, well, I can make it to that 5%. So what I'm saying is, well, I guess there's a couple of things I'm saying. One, you could raise the bar and we're still going to play that game. Two, we can't everybody get up here unless you're aiming for some sort of communist utopia where we're all equal. But even in communist utopia, some are more equal than others, comrade. And the most realistic of all of this, all of us have all sorts of potential, and most of us don't get as far as we could given our potential, which means I got a better shot because I'm willing to work harder than you, and I'm willing to think smarter than you. But notice, that plays perfectly into this, because as long as I'm willing to work harder and think smarter, and you're willing to work harder and think smarter, and you want to reduce my pay, that's okay, because I still don't want her to have the job. That game keeps us down, and these guys very well to do. Now, I'm not trying to indoctrinate anybody, but I am trying to get you to see how a Marxist would look at this situation, okay? So the second point, capitalism isn't played out. Marx thought this was going to be sort of a mechanical overturning, but he recognized that most of the world had to be brought under the sphere of industrial capitalism. And we're not really there yet. One way to interpret why things are tough for us now in the United States over the last 5 years is finally the rest of the world is catching up. And as long as people in Thailand can make our crap for this much money, and our people want $50,000 to work in a factory, those jobs are going to go to Thailand. So we're not going to have a revolution until Thailand catches up with us and we're reduced to Thailand. I shouldn't say Thailand. I'm thinking Taiwan, aren't I? But does it matter? No. And that makes sense, right? So until capitalism is really, truly around the globe, we're not going to have a revolution. And think of the monopoly game. Does a monopoly game end when 2 of the 6 players have most of the money? When 3 of the 6 players have most of the money? No, the monopoly game ends when 1 person has all the money, and then the system breaks down. So even if it seems like we live in a world of unfair, and I hate the word unfair because it's a very loaded word, but a world of what seem to be unfair advantages right now, inequalities, you'll notice that there's still enough of them that there's competition between them. And we still have enough that we can whine, but for the most part, we're getting food, we're getting healthcare, we have a place to live. It's just not as nice as we would like. Well, when the monopoly game ends, the people on the bottom, they don't get to just have food that's not what they wanted. They don't get to live in a trailer, not a nice apartment, or an apartment and not a standalone home. The system breaks in monopoly, okay? So that's another reason Marxists would say, we're not there yet, all right? Here's another thing. I don't know about you, but, well, I'm guessing most of you, well, I'm trying to look at the age here. Some of you have retirement accounts, right? And you're not cashing in on them yet because you're not there yet. I have a retirement account, which I'm not cashing in on because I'm really not there yet. If you've got $1 million in a 401k somewhere, what does that actually mean? Well, it means a couple of things. One thing is you own actually a lot of stock, right? And what's stock? Stock are tiny slices of the corporations that make all of our crap, right? So you own tiny slices of what Marx would call the means of production, right? You might not be as well off as Romney or Gates or Buffett, but you own a slice of Coca-Cola. And if we went up there, you could point to that bolt and you say, I own that bolt. Might not make you feel real special, but that bolt there is making Coke some money, and that's a good thing, okay? Now, in an ideal sort of world, we could see that maybe everybody in the US could have an adequately funded 401k. That would be awesome. That's a part of what they're trying to sell us when they talk about privatizing retirement. It's a great vision. If actually everybody in the US had a retirement account by the time they were 65 that was $1 million that they could retire on, you will notice we actually built something that looks a lot like what communism said it was aiming for. The people in the community own the means of production in common. It's just instead of having the government own it and run it, and we belong to the government, we own it in tiny little slices. Now, of course, all this was invented long after Marx died, so we don't get to see what he had to say about it. But it is striking that this is beginning to address some of the exact issues Marx was complaining about. All right? And finally, the Yoda quote here. I don't care how smart Marx was. The future is very hard to see. And sometimes smart people are more dangerous because they know they're smart and they have confidence that they shouldn't actually have. Marx's analysis could be 100% completely spot on. I don't think it is, but those are different reasons. But it could be, and he still doesn't know enough to adequately guess the future. If you did know enough to adequately guess the future, people wouldn't make and lose millions on the stock market every day. If you could guess the future, there'd be no point in Vegas taking odds on things, right? And even if you had the vectors of change correct, you don't necessarily have the timing right? I mean, even just thinking about the housing bubble in 2008, there were plenty of people that thought the housing bubble was going to pop. Some of them were saying in 2005 it was going to pop. But you know, if you sold in 2005, you lost 3 years worth of appreciation. If you would have bailed out of your stocks, you would have not maximized. And there are other people that said, oh, it's going to go down and things are going to bounce right back. You know, things sort of crept back a little. Even the smartest people can't tell you what's going to happen in the future. And Marx falls into that bucket too. Absolutely. So he could be right as well as he can, and still, what makes him think that he can see the end of history 200 years from now when all of the globe goes through a revolution that follows a certain pattern? See what I'm saying? And so those are all legitimate complaints. They're not complaints, but, you know, if he was right, there should have been a revolution. Why isn't there? Well, here are some weaknesses that could matter. I said that. That leads us to Weber, and we only have like 3 minutes. So let me finish by saying we'll do the test this weekend. If there are Weber questions, they will only be questions referring to what the book said about Weber. And I know that you're going to be concerned mostly about the test, but I want you to think, and I want you to pay attention over the weekend. There's two sorts of problems. One is, listen to the way people are talking about diet and fitness. Oh, those fat people, right? They must be stupid and lazy. Just pay attention to the way folks talk about this and listen to what they say. And the other one is, what's the other one? Oh, the environment. Listen to the way people talk about the environment. Why should you buy a Prius? What is actually the problem? And I just want you to, again, pay attention to the discourse around these things. Now, the discourse is tickling that collective consciousness, right? Pay attention to how people talk about these things, and we will step back into Weber on Monday. Thanks, everybody, and have a great weekend. We got the best college in the world.